moved into lockdown, weren't able to. We've engaged with you all individually in small groups in the intervening period to give you our thinking to that point. This further refines our thinking. Just to be really clear, there are no decisions particularly required from this paper, but what we're wanting to do throughout this exercise is keep you really well connected to our thinking, what we are proposing, the path that we see ahead. We really want to get your brutal and honest and direct input to this, particularly interested in identifying early roadblocks or barriers that we might think are immovable on reflection, so that we can quickly take the exit ramp if that's the case. If we kind of get to the point where we say, actually, this thing is just not able to go any further because of the issues that have been raised, I would rather have figured that out early in the process than get months down the track. With Campbell's time, he's seconded out of his usual role into this role. So both his time and some of the small investment we're making around, commissioning reports on this, that we avoid unnecessary and unwasted effort. So just reinforcing, we're not spending $1 on a block of land or a tree going on the ground in relation to this project. Obviously doing lots of that through our ECS related activities. And this is purely to give you the current thinking, the direction of travel, so that you can tell us whether you think it's right or wrong, and if it's wrong, why, so that we can go and see if we can figure out how to deal with that and bring back further advice.
Okay, well, I can assure you that you'll get honest. I can't promise you brutal, but that might be an optional extra.
The other one.
So Campbell.
Thanks, Ian. That was a very good lead-in. So I guess just, and we've had some of those conversations over the last few weeks, as Ian said, in small groups or individually, but I really just wanted to talk through these particular things today. And as our chair at this at the lunch break, if we could hold questions until the presentation finished, there's literally 7 or 8 slides, so it's not a long one. But if we could do questions on the presentation and the agenda item at the end of that, that would be appreciated.
There we go.
So in essence, we've got a really significant mismatch between land use and land capability and soil capability. And that plays itself out in terms of stock on steep eroding hill country, which then does what it does and erodes significantly, creating all sorts of issues in terms of water quality and a wide range of other things. Fundamental to the heart of this conversation, and I'll touch on that a little bit later, is actually this is about substantially about people. The investment is about planting, yes, and it's about investment and funding, but fundamentally this is about people, and it's often about farmer values and how they see the role of agricultural production on their farm. But if you looked at the modelling from SEDNet, which admittedly is only a model, but it's actually a model which has proven in the Horizons instance to be reasonably accurate broadly when you get onto a farm, there is somewhere between 250 and 380,000 hectares of our region which is currently defined as highly erodible by the model. And whether you set your trigger level at 1,000 tonnes per square kilometre per annum, or you set it at 750, whichever way you look at it, it's still a very large number in terms of the area which it's saying is at risk of erosion. And in the last 4 or 5 months, what that has simply led me to is actually the scale of the planting challenge is really large if we're going to have any significant impact on the problem. And that means we've got a leadership role, because clearly something needs to change, because if we had the solution in place or it was working right now, we wouldn't be in the position where we are in terms of the mismatch between land use and land and soil capability. So the other comment I wanted to make around this is just around, we make a significant investment, and it's a cornerstone investment, and we have done as for many years as a council in conversations around sustainable land use and putting trees in the ground on the farm. And that's been our role for decades. In the last couple of years, we've significantly increased the scale and potential impact of that through the investment in the erosion control scheme. And that's really targeted to the worst possible areas on a farm where you don't expect to get any sort of return other in terms of commercial return or financial return other than the outcomes we're getting from mitigating sediment loss from those areas that are planted and or the other biodiversity or other outcomes. But what this basically means is we've got our catchment management advisors, who are really this organisation's substantial resource, if not 80% of it, then more, for delivering on-ground change in the region. They've got extremely good tools in terms of the ECS and pole planting, but actually that's going to deal with, if you're generous, that's going to deal with about 20 to 25% of the total problem in terms of the planting solution required at a regional scale to affect the change we want in sediment reduction. And that's really important, because what we're saying here is, complementary to our investments in the ECS and in things like pole planting, we need to have additional tools for those people so that when they're out there, they're delivering as much as they can of the whole solution on the single farm. And so that is not just the ECS and pole planting, but it's a broader afforestation option, and it's also a riparian planting option as well. In terms of current investments, the only other comment I'll make is obviously we've got a forest asset, and we've got, and in particular in relation to that, we've got Tūtera, where about 7 or 8 years ago, we put a high UMF Manuka plantation in, really as a trial to help us to learn how it would play out as a tool in our hill country, in our regional afforestation context. And so the only other comment around current investment is that we've actually learned an awful lot about the role and the potential advantages and disadvantages of Manuka in the context as a tool for afforestation. Now this here, effectively, this graph, these pie charts rather, are really to show, I guess, where we're placed at the moment in terms of our current investments, and where we potentially could go to complement those to get additional impact on the sediment and erosion challenge. The red is effectively unmitigated sediment loss from the areas that SEDNet says is eroding. The green is the areas the area that's going to be, or the amount that's going to be reduced in terms of regional sediment loss across the region as a result of a 3-decade planting program. There are 4 investment contexts set out there. The first one on your top left is where you simply invest your current 30 million a year in the ECS, and you do that for the next 3 decades. And this, to be fair, these numbers have been done by the land science team, but they are to be broadly reflective of the context we're talking about around leverage, our role and the potential for impact.
Sorry, Campbell, 30 million over 10 years, not 30 million per year?
No, 30 million per decade for
Yeah,
3
per decade.
for 3 decades. So
Yes,
each of
yes.
these is based on 3 decades and an investment of different proportions. So that's the top left. And roughly, you'll see you can mitigate around about 25% of the regional sediment load if you do that. Then if you move over and you decide you want to have that 30 million and an additional investment for a total of 150 million over 3 decades, then effectively you're mitigating around 37%. You're planting about 75,000 hectares. Now that again is based on an ECS type grant-funded context. The bottom left, that's where you make an investment, and the investment actually has up to 50% of its capital recycled per decade. And so you can see the impact of that is you've gone from 25% with just an ECS investment up to a significantly greater impact on the regional sediment loads. And the final pie chart on the bottom right is simply saying if you invested the 150 million total, of which 50% of the capital is recycled per decade, and as a result of partnerships of others, you brought in $1 for every $4 that we put on the table, then you're going to plant a whole lot more, and your regional sediment reduction is going to be greater as well. So again, the principle behind this for me was about not necessarily the detail of this, but it was more about the principle that actually, realistically, we've probably got about a $600 million investment requirement as a minimum if you consider that we're planting 200,000 hectares at $3,000 a hectare. So if you said there's a $600 million investment requirement, clearly we don't have the capital to go out and do that completely as a grant-funded style model. And so what this is attempted to illustrate is that we will be benefited by recycling our capital and getting other partner investment in to this as well. So it's simply about that principle. And that principle is really important because ultimately, by itself, we actually need additional mechanisms to fund in addition to the ECS and pole planting. But those mechanisms, if they're just grant funding mechanisms, we will not have the likely impact that we could if we were able to recycle some of that capital. And that's the strategic shift that I'm suggesting. And in terms of the long-term plan business case, this is really important because the strategic shift is that we, as part of the business case, looked to identify a way to have a self-funding integrated on-farm planting program. So it's an additional to and complementary to our grant funding mechanisms, but we actively try and explore that in an impact investment context. Now, impact investment is something which has been talked about probably more over the last 2 to 5 years. It's been around a bit longer. Impact investment at its heart says that when you invest, you seek to drive other outcomes other than just necessarily financial ones. But that said, impact investment, your financial return could be equal to a current commercial return, better than a current commercial return, or less than a current commercial return. So just because you're choosing to do an impact investment doesn't automatically mean that you're not going to drive useful financial outcomes. But it does mean, and I think this is important to the overall principle of this, that we invest in a way where we drive other outcomes alongside revenue streams that make the planting as much as possible self-funding. And for me, fundamentally, given the scale of the challenge, that is the best way to complement our current investments and actually get impact on it at a regional scale. You'll see in the paper there's some indicative financials. And look, again, this needs to be done in a whole lot more detail with a whole bunch of sensitivity and thought gone into it. But the indicative financials are modelled out at around about a 5% interest cost. It's based on the idea that we might borrow and actually that we would repay our borrowing through the revenue streams from the self-funding planting. In doing so, it's the 5% interest cost, program management costs are included, and then it assumes that landowners get all the returns after we've had our capital recycled, if you like. Now, there's lots of different ways you could cut this sort of investment in terms of lots of different ways you could partner both with the farmer and others to drive the planting outcome and a range of different financial outcomes. So this is just an indicative, in principle, do the numbers work well enough that it might actually be worth investigating further for the next 2 or 3 months as part of a business case for the LTP. And what it shows is, with those assumptions around a 5% interest cost and project management, etc. included, that in a situation where there are the likes of subsidies, billion trees or others, you would potentially have the farmer starting to make a return in year 7, and where there were no subsidies, the return for the farmer stretches out to about year 11. But again, really indicative financials, more just to illustrate that conceptually it might work. The other comment I'd make is around landowner participation in this. So just like we do for the ECS and just like we do for pole planting, it's the farmer's choice as to whether or not they want to plant and partner, assuming there isn't a compliance-based, requirement driving it. So it's their choice whether or not they want to plant and partner with us. And also based on the other comment around this is based on the current success of the ECS, it would be fair to assume, given the scale of potential planting that could take place, that uptake of this sort of investment, if it was 100% funded by us, should conceptually at least be able to drive reasonable planting targets over time. Just a couple more slides. So look, challenges, risks and opportunities, and look, there's a whole range of challenges, risks and opportunities around this, and they need to be explored more fully over the next 2 or 3 months if you think this idea is worth progressing over that time. That includes, and the report talks about it, there's harvest risks, there's pest risks, there's risks around carbon management, there's risks to our balance sheet, which has been raised before, and we have to consider the overall impact of additional investment in this context. So there's a wide range of things that would need to be worked through. But one thing that's cropped up on regular occasions in the conversations I've had with you, and that has been the opportunity to have other partners involved, and there's a range of different views on that. But I would absolutely say without a shadow of a doubt that there are partners out there who are interested in investing alongside us in an integrated on-farm planting context, not in a whole farm afforestation context. They're interested in planting with us in an integrated on-farm way. And it really comes down to understanding if we want to make an investment and therefore get into a serious conversation with them around partnership and what that might mean in the detail. But I think there's a real opportunity there. Derby Partners is listed in your paper as an example of a potential partner. They've been really good to work with. They, for example, have mooted the idea at a high level that they put up capital to a planting program of this nature, that they provide a turnkey delivery service, so a third party who does all the delivery for the farmers, etc., and they take part of the revenue streams as part of the overall deal alongside the farmer and us. I guess the point I'm making is if we choose to proceed with this conceptually, there are partners we could get into conversations with who are interested in investing. And finally, the last point there, and again, this is about people. If you look at the riparian context in the region, we've known about the value of planting riparian strips for probably 20 years in terms of research and technical data. So our investment in this, what we need to make sure we do is take our farming community with us and make sure we invest significantly as part of the project in that overall process of designing it with them. Finally, timeline. By October, the intention is to deliver a business case for an LTP investment. We're framing that as probably, that means that we would come to you with an indicative funding for year 1 and 2 of the new LTP, and that would be about finalising the due diligence, because we're not going to do it all in the next 2 or 3 months. There's a bit that needs to be worked through. But potentially subject to you being happy over time that was shaping up as a realistic investment, then you would be on ground in year 3 of the LTP. Potentially sooner, but that would depend on the due diligence itself. Anyway, so that's happy to take questions on any aspect of the presentation or the paper.
We'll just go to general questions. I've got one. Could you just explain how you recycle the money? It sounds like a merry-go-round. Are you in some sort of funny money deal? Should we be talking to some other political parties?
Circular economy.
Doesn't grow on trees, you know.
So, look, the short answer is no, it's definitely not funny money. All I'm doing is making, in our current model, and in terms of our current investments in afforestation, effectively we either almost fully fund it via rates or we grant fund it effectively. And so what that means is, in the case of the ECS, $3 million of our capital goes out to drive outcomes in terms of planting. And that's great, it's driving those outcomes and it's intended to do that. Recycling that capital, if some revenue streams were coming off an investment and even if it was only 1.5 or $2 million of that was being recovered over time through honey or carbon or timber, that would mean that that capital was being freed up to put back into the problem. Does that make sense?
Yep.
No. So at the moment we give 75% of the planting cost under the ECS as a recycling proposition that the council lends instead and recovers it over time. Otherwise, how does the money come back to us?
So we lend and recover it over time.
And that's with a 5% interest rate you've applied.
Correct.
Okay.
So that's based on the modelling for 5%.
So we are bank at 5%, 7 to 11 years, depending on whether the subsidy.
That's right.
Councillor Curtin.
Thank you very much. I just want to road test some of your assumptions here. Can I take you to paragraph 36 of your paper and just put some numbers here? We've got the
Paragraph, what was the paragraph?
36.
36.
You've got the ECS 3.5 mil. If we could talk about the number in the 2021 budget. ECS 3.5 mil. What's your riparian planting scheme budget?
So sorry, you're on paragraph 36?
Yes.
36, he's talking about 36.2.
Oh, 36.2, I can answer that. So the riparian plant scheme is a scheme that,
Yeah, what's the number?
What's the number? How much we put
oh, we
on?
don't put a dollar into it other than staff time. That's about buying plants at wholesale prices and on selling them to landowners at wholesale prices.
And your poplar and willows poles, how much? How much?
Oh, well, again, they're eligible for the 75% subsidy on erosion-prone land. So space poles are part of the ECS program.
So I'm tallying up here, 3.7 mil is the current spend or budget for the package of interventions that are being described as the offering to landowners. Is that?
You're talking about the grant-related offering to
Well,
landowners?
what we've got is this proposal to plant up 200,000 hectares at a cost of 600 million over 3 decades. The tools that we currently have, I'm seeing the fourth one was ecosystem priority. So I'm trying to aggregate all of our current spend
Oh, okay. So
and understand because you're going to need 20 million a year
Yeah.
for 30 years to do that.
yeah. So,
At the moment, we've got something like 4 million.
yeah. So in just to be really crystal clear here, that the activities you're describing are grant-funded activities. So we basically provide money to people to do stuff. So you've got about 3.2 million in this coming financial. In fact, today, this financial year, 3.2 million for the ECS related work.
Yep.
There's 200,000 for the EP sites.
Yep.
There's 800 or 700,000 for the EEF, the Environmental Enhancement Fund projects.
Okay, that's not down here, but
Well,
carry
that's
on. Yep.
part of our
Okay,
grant
no, that's fine.
related activity. That's targeting those parts of the landscape that are places where you're not going there to make a dollar. You are simply
Okay.
going there to
Yeah, no,
fix a problem.
Sorry, I'm just wanting to conceptualise where this is, because the ask that you put up in the paper is 20 million a year, and my calculation 7,000 hectares a year.
No, can I just clarify, please? That's not what the paper's saying.
No.
So fundamentally, what I'm saying, if you wanted to go ahead and plant 200,000 hectares, because you felt that was sufficient to drive significant impact in terms of sediment and erosion in the region,
Yes.
you're going to need 600 million.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying here is, actually, to complement the other investments we're making, we could also make an investment which recycles its own capital.
Irrespective
Yep.
of that, I
But
know
it's-
exactly
yep.
where you're going.
Yep.
So, but what I'm trying to determine is the scale of this thing and what's needed. No, irrespective of where the money's coming from, this is a program which plans on planting 7,000 hectares a year, and no.
No, definitely not. I don't think operationally in the short term or even the medium term that's realistic.
Well, I've just done the maths on 200,000 hectares over 30 years. That's all I did.
Yeah, we took
But you
a
wouldn't
lot
do it all in 30
No,
years. You wouldn't. You wouldn't even get probably close to it. But you might do X amount more than we're currently doing with our current initiatives.
Sorry, if you're saying that you're looking to plant 200,000 hectares over 30 years,
I'm not saying that.
No, we
I'm
haven't
saying
said
the
that.
total issue in terms of the region might be that you end up having to plant 200,000 hectares, but actually, where you choose to go in terms of the amount you choose to plant of that over time and how you choose to fund it is your decision.
So we haven't put a particular time frame on it. We've said that's the total area, and based on a $3,000 per hectare investment to forest it, it's $600 million.
Yeah.
Now, you could cut and dice that 100 different ways in terms of the area you wanted to cover, the speed you wanted to go at. All of those things become relevant to the kind of conversation we're having is, well, that's the scale of the problem. If we do it on our own using just a grant-funded program, it will take a long
really
time.
do get it.
If we can, and it's the question I think you asked in our session, how much do you need? And I'm saying, well, how much are you offering? Because we can make this go as fast or as slow as you want, depending on the level of investment you put in there. And then the other part of it is who else can we get into this as well? Derby partners and others. The more capital you have coming in, the faster you will potentially drive uptake.
sure. But globally, I'll go back to it, your proposition was that we're needing to plant 200,000 hectares about. Is that right? To cover to meet the sediment loading that we've got, to challenge the sediment
Okay,
loading.
so I think I get
Yeah,
now
I
where
get
the
you.
disconnect is. So in the original ECS proposition, I put to you that there's about 252,000 hectares of eroding, highly erodible land in the region. That's our most vulnerable land, based on sediment modelling. So that's based on 1,000 tonnes per square kilometre per year of sediment yield. If we, which is quite a high yield, if we come back to setting our bar at 750 tonnes per square kilometre per year, you're up to the 300,000 to 400,000 hectares in the region that's at risk.
Sure.
So what this proposition is doing is looking to kind of put a stake in the ground to say, well, look, if we could deal with a couple of 100,000, this is what it's starting to look like. You may well say, hey, not good enough. We want to do all of it. We want to do 400,000 of the stuff that's 750 tonnes per year and more.
But based on that assumption of 300,000, 200,000, call it 210,000 for the sake of the argument, if we chose that one, we would need to plant up 210,000 hectares, right?
Yep.
Yep.
At $3,000 a hectare.
Yep.
So that's our global funding requirement if we chose that as our target to plant. Would that be fair?
Yep.
So if we if we bring that down to on an annual basis, we're needing to plant up about 7,000 hectares each year at a cost of about $20 million.
Yep.
And we're going to fund that through what we've already committed, we'll potentially fund it through the 3.5, 4 million we've got sitting there.
All right, that's separate.
Separate.
This is a separate proposition.
But isn't it on top of?
It's on, well, it's
I mean,
if
it's a
it's on,
different funding mechanism.
Yeah.
get
It's
that,
complementary
but
to
It's
the
complementary to
Well, I
it.
think
It's
it's
not the
same
same
We're on
as.
the same page, I think.
Yeah.
So what we're needing to find is about 16 million from investment sources or borrowing or some other source to make the proposition work.
sure.
So now I'll get to my question is,
But sorry, is that agreed?
Well, no,
Because
well,
I'm
look,
struggling with that too.
that is just one
Just for-
scenario.
Just for the sake of argument,
hypothetical.
just let him ask the question, we'll then come back and re-drill it. Where you go.
it's really getting down to reality testing the proposal. So it's about, can we plant 7,000 hectares, engage with enough people to make that happen, if that was our proposition?
But that's not our proposition.
But just
Let's just assume it is.
Can I
Just assume-
answer
just
that? Can I answer that?
just assume it is, otherwise we
So
won't get
if
to
we,
it.
if we were to assume that that was the proposition,
Yeah.
I believe that is not realistic for a whole bunch of reasons. But personally, that is not the proposition. What we're putting forward to you to say, how quickly do you want to go on this and how much do you want to invest? And more fundamentally, are you happy with the idea of an impact investment where you drive revenue streams from the planting program so it self-funds itself?
So I could draw the maths up for you, but
Yeah, so I guess, look, perhaps just to expand on the answer, is that to go from where we are today and to drive 7,000 hectares a year in a 2 or 3 year period is unrealistic, because there is a whole lot of groundwork we would have to do to prepare the farming community for that. Because right now, read the headlines and look at social media, there's a great deal of anxiety around trees on farm.
Yep.
So we've got an uphill conversation around, getting uptake and even getting through the farm gate to deliver that. I guess the point is this is really circular. If we're not, if the men and women who are working in our catchment advisory space, who are working with landowners, are not taking tools with them on farm like this diversified tree investment, those conversations will never happen, and therefore our uptake curve will never start to grow. So at some point you get onto this bit of machinery and you start moving it. And I guess the point out of all of this would be that the proposition says this would effectively run at no cost to the council, because the money you would make from your return on investment pays for, self-funds the model. So all you need to do is get the thing moving. And if you do 1,000 hectares in your first year or 100,000 hectares in the first year, is probably irrelevant. Until you get started, you won't get it moving. And if it's cost neutral, and all you're having to do is acquire and put out both risk and put out there some of your capital to get this thing moving, and you don't use all of the capital that you've put up or you've made available, it stays in the bank, and there's again no further cost to us. So for us to kind of give you an answer to say, yep, we can, if you sign up to this in this long-term plan and we'll deliver you 7,000 hectares per year, is just not realistic. What we could say though is that it then introduces another tool to the toolbox for people to start driving uptake. And then obviously the next bit is, well, let's get it to that 7,000.
And over the next 2 or 3 months, we could come back to you as part of the business case and say, this is what we think is a realistic level of investment and scaling it up in terms of planting on ground.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. So, my understanding, if I can get this right, is your proposition is there's 4 scenarios, one of which involves around 100,000 hectares of planting. We're not involving another partner. We would be lending, that's scenario 3, I think. We would be lending, lending the money to the landowner, who, in the expectation that they would generate some revenue from the diverse, the range of plants that they're planting, and recycle, as you say, that money back to us. That's scenario 3, right? Have I got that?
Scenario 3, so yes it is, although simply we'd probably put it differently, we'd be entering into agreements with them that the revenues would be shared, with our paying back of the loan coming first, and then getting revenue post that. But effectively the same principle.
So the question I've got is, can this council borrow to put up that base capital that we then return back from the landowner and over the long term? So we could borrow to do this.
That's what the business case would tell you.
And the scale of what we're talking about at, say, 100,000, which gives you about a 50% sediment reduction, would be about $300 million over 30 years.
But it wouldn't, as I understand, it wouldn't be $300 million sunk. It would be money put in, money paid back, then put back in again.
That's the total pool that would be recycled. Okay, so that was my question. So, all right, so that's what we'd be. You might be able to come back to us then with a model that said, if you were to shoot at that type of range, 50% sediment reduction, this is the amount you'd need to borrow over 10 years in your long-term plan. These are the types of structures that could be put in place with landowners, etc. And these are the types of returns you might get. And I think there's mention there also this could be done through HBRIC, or it could be done through some other entity. Right?
So just on that, I think absolutely we'll be able to come back to you in the next 2 or 3 months with a much clearer outline of the investment in the context potentially than these pie graphs, because they seem to have confused things a little. They were really simply there to highlight the principle of leverage. And actually, I think that hasn't worked as well as I would have anticipated. So yes, we could come back to you with that. And then the second question is around structure, and so definitely over the next 2 or 3 months, if you think this idea of a self-funding planting program is worth progressing, we will be coming back to you with additional thoughts on structure and how it might best work.
Yeah, my one other question, Mr. Chairman, was there's something here, a reference to a critical gap, which is similar to a gap we were talking about this morning. The advisory gap, and every conversation we've had from the one last December that I saw online was, a question of what is this council's role? Are we in the market? Are we market correcting? What are we doing? Or are we an advisor? In other words, the resource that is able to put the gumboots on, go and talk to the farmers, hear from them about their dreams for their farm, talk to them about solutions that might work for them. If this is the critical gap in this council's ability to deliver an effective integrated regional forestation initiative, that's paragraph 37, should we be having a long-term plan discussion about plugging that gap?
You're talking about councillor putting people on farm to engage with landowners.
I'm talking about plugging the gap revealed at paragraph 37, whether we retain consultants or we hire someone or a team of people to provide advice. So
it's a really, really good question. I guess go back to the comment I made earlier about our catchment advisors. So we are building that workforce of people, and currently they're engaging with the landowner community on the ECS related bits of work alongside many other things. this is another tool that they take onto the farm with them. The intent would be that those people broker the opportunities or the relationships then with the party, whether it's a third party or a council investment arm or whatever. They broker the relationship, which then connects the landowner to that integrated tree option, and then they do the deal. So they're out there creating the opportunity because they're on farm with a whole lot of giveaways, you know, the ECS related stuff. While they're there, this is the sort of stuff that they want to be able to kind of address with the landowner. Right now, they're hamstrung because they can deal with a portion of the problem, but not a whole chunk of the problem. We want to give them
Just
more.
answer the thing. Seems to me what we're asking is the same person from the regional council to go not only with the ECS, be able to take other options as well.
Yeah.
So we're giving more tasks to the one person, not asking for more persons for the task.
Correct.
So we're not needing to get a new FTE or more.
Well, that goes to your scale,
Yeah.
appetite, so, yeah.
Councillor Foss?
So thanks, you, to the end there, I think you clarified. So what you're really saying, and this is in the strategic goal, this is where the 600 mil comes from. By 2050, all erodible land is under tree cover, therefore will require an investment of 600 mil. So what you're saying is, if someone spends 600 mil between now and 2050, all highly erodible land will be under tree cover of some shape or form, right?
Yep.
So that's okay. So I'm still not sure what you're asking of at any one time of the balance sheet of this organisation to park over there to enable this to happen. I just don't see that number somewhere.
That's because we don't have it there.
We haven't given you one.
Oh, well, there you go.
Can I say to you,
These are very big numbers.
could I just say to cut through this, I just think you're going to have this conversation on how the money is recycled. Because it seems to me everybody's got their heads on 600 million, and people are looking at it and seeing it's 600 million. But when you talk to me about recycling, it could be that we have a seed fund of 10 or 20 million, and then we invest it, get the money back for it, reinvest it, get the money back, reinvest it, co-partner with others, and so on. So the actual cost of the council might be substantially less than the 600 million, but you put the 600 million on the table and people see the 600 million. So you'll need to show
Can we do that in the current paper, Chair?
Well,
Because
you can.
actually it's in there.
Is it?
Yes, it
I'm
is.
just reading your current.
Oh,
paper.
Yeah.
yeah.
So firstly, at the end there's effectively a case study of a property that was done as part of the Right to Right Place project,
Yeah.
1,245 hectares, and the farm consultant did a desktop study and said there's 300 hectares there that potentially should be planted in trees. And so then what you've got is some financial analysis around the 300 hectares, and that provides you an overview of that 300 hectares being potentially planted in, for example, manuka and eucalyptus, and driving revenue streams through carbon and honey, and that's in the paper as well in terms of your appendices. So if you join those two together, what that shows you is that the actual example of a farm and an example of the revenue streams coming from carbon and honey, which then come back to pay, first and foremost, council's borrowing to do the planting.
Yeah, no,
Yep.
I get all of that.
Just about, you've gone straight down operational, you know, Manuka versus something else, but that's very interesting, and it's one case study that's still very interesting. It reflects in that financial model you've got there. But up here, I'm a ratepayer and I own 1/160,000th of this council, right? And so we've discovered that the 600 mil was over, 30 years? Okay, that's interesting. Many questions about where's as to whose 600 mil that is over time and how many times it's churned. So a great void of information there to be supplied. That's interesting. Further is you seem to move between grants and partnerships and on-farm funding, I think was one of your last slides. So I'm allergic to grants in this space. You use the term, so you had deduced it.
And I can explain.
Okay,
Yep.
but this private benefit of public spend is toxic. You know, that's a smaller version of corporate welfare, which none of us really are particularly big fans of, shall we say. So I don't just see it. So I guess I've got quite a few questions in around this. We've all had our discussions. Perhaps a whole lot more information or discussions need to happen, because I'm still not sure, and I'm running for the hills at the moment, because if I look at the preparation of the paper, I don't see any of the financial people have had a look at the paper. Have they?
They have. Our finance team have been closely involved in doing the modelling.
And do they recommend Hawke's Bay Regional Council to look at this, hey, this could be bigger than Ben Hur, this would be quite interesting, because if that scenario plays out, that means we're in the forestry, manuka business.
Yeah. So just
But we're not on many other businesses, it doesn't.
Yeah. So look,
sound right.
I hear you. So there's a range of things that need to take place before you could even be remotely comfortable that this was an investment you want to make. But fundamentally, the question on this is, do you want me to spend the next 2 or 3 months looking at a self-funding planting model on the basis that it might provide us the best opportunity for leverage and impact in terms of regional afforestation? Or do you want to call it now and I will go back and do my biosecurity?
So that is very, my answer is yes, of course.
Right.
That's all we're being asked.
So
about.
that's all you're being
being
asked for
asked
at this point.
Well,
And it just, if I could just
been halfway
provide the
getting
clarity
there.
around the grant funding
Just,
piece.
just stop
Chair?
there. I'm conscious of time here. I want to, but it seems to me, yeah, no, it's important. But I just think at the headline level, we agree on maximising our opportunity to cover, to reduce erosion. We all agree with that. What it seems to me is at the moment there's so murkiness about how we do that, the numbers, the mechanisms, the processes. So I don't know if we're going to actually solve that here today to the extent it will satisfy people. So what I was actually thinking of, there are people around here who are really, really interested in those things. And why don't you channel that part off to the, dare I say it, the all-powerful Finance Audit and Risk Committee, and then go and do the numbers with them and so on with there. And then they come back and say, we've run the numbers, we've done the numbers, we're okay with them. The rest of us will say, fine.
well, yeah, there's 2 curveballs I've got today, but that's all right. As long as everyone else is comfortable with that, 'cause everyone's welcome. But it's, you're right. It's that high level, yes, I think, but I don't know what some other colleagues feel about that. It's just, I think there's so many signals that this thing sends the moment we make a decision about it.
But that's the point I'm
I
suggesting
know.
goes back
So,
to Finance
yes.
Audit and Risk, because there are aspects, views that you'll get with that, and you'll have to report back to council, so we all have the chance to go through it. But having, you guys have gone through it beforehand,
Yeah.
we'll have got the material information into a pack which you're comfortable with, and then we'll find easy to get. At the moment, we've got a mismatch. So your graphs there are great, but I agree, they're not the right target for this audience.
Chair, could I just,
Sorry?
It's
could
just
I,
all hypothetical.
yeah, it's
Sorry.
all hypothetical. Could I just request that perhaps it's difficult to have this discussion in the construct of a committee meeting. It would be really helpful for us to have a workshop
Yeah.
session on this where we can get into it, more of a debate and discussion around it and go through some of the stuff. I'd look very happy to work through the FAR committee if that's the advice of council, but it would be good to get into some of the very issues that Councillor Foss and Councillor Curtin have raised in a workshop session with a whiteboard, get the discussion going. I'd really like that opportunity because we've missed that through the last 3 months with lockdown.
So take that, yes, please keep thinking about it, and we'll work with FARS to we'll eventually end up with a different paper, which will be a Reader's Digest, the first
Sure.
version.
Yep.
And then we'll report back as soon as we can. Is that acceptable to everybody else?
Yeah.
And I just think doing the finance and numbers on how to with the FARS committee would be a really useful thing. Then you've then got an agreed document to come back. This is how it's financed, and we've got what the strategic vision is, the mechanisms of how it's to do, how it fits with the plan. People have been over the numbers and shown in the various forms how it's how councillors understand it, but also we're going to need to be able to put this into the public arena. So it's going to road test it to make sure the public get it as well, because the public wouldn't get this from us. And that's the point that Craig is making. So we need to have it digestible for several levels, so it's quite a bit of work.
Chairman, I've just got one other comment. I think this is a fantastic idea. I'm incredibly excited about it. I just don't want us walking out of this room today thinking it's a $600 million problem and therefore a bad idea, because I just don't think that that's the message we've been actually given here. That's an extraordinarily hypothetical number, and if you start from what you're trying to achieve and work forwards, I think we'd probably land in a better place.
Yep. Is there any other questions, comments?
Oh, I've got a comment. I mean,
Oh, good. Yeah, thank you.
thank you.
It's strangely silent this afternoon.
Strangely silent. I mean, I disagree with Martin. I'm reading what is in front of me,
Yeah.
and it says what it says, and you can draw a conclusion that the all highly erodible land is under tree cover by 2050 at a cost of 600 mil.
Yeah.
Now, the mechanism are variable and diffuse, and there's churn and there's all sorts of stuff. But that's the high level equation,
Sure.
and that is the executive summary at 2 and 3, and that's what I'm reading now. I still believe, which after we've iterated it out and explored the mechanics of it, we still end up at that place.
Well, do you want to do this or not, Neil, or do you just want to take to task 2 paragraphs of an executive summary and kill the
Well,
whole
Martin,
thing?
you're saying that I don't understand it, but I'm just reading what
Well,
I'm
so
reading.
what? That's what it is.
So,
That's not.
so I'm not challenging the need to do it. I'm very enthusiastic about the
Right.
need to do it. But what I'm suggesting is, in the presentation thereof, is it realistic that we target 250 to 380,000 hectares when we don't really mean that? Is it a lesser number? Should we be choosing?
Entirely your discretion.
Could I just say that we can go back and forth on this for quite a long time here today. I just think let's take this as the first cut. It's going to come back, and we can challenge some of the numbers at that point. But I'd like to see as Craig's identified, the numbers underneath it and how it works. We don't have that. So I'm looking to say that the recommendation here, that we receive the report, note it. The second part, that we ask the staff to prepare an appropriate business case to be brought back. That the financials are considered by the Finance and Audit and Risk Committee with the staff to be brought back as part of that business case. And that this come back at the earliest possible time to the Environment Committee.
How about to a workshop?
So, yeah, look, I think we need a workshop as part of and we'll do it as part of the long-term plan workshops.
Okay, we've got a workshop on
Yeah. But you're right, there's more work to be done, Chair. Can I just make one other comment on this? The $600 million and the 250,000 to 380,000 hectares is a regional problem and a regional scale of investment. The regional council's contribution to that is what's incredibly flexible and scalable. One of the options for this is that this is done entirely by regulation. So the National Policy Statement on Freshwater Management requires this council to deal with sediment. Theoretically, at least, and it will need to be tested and will be tested in the fullness of time, our plan changes could require every single hectare of this to be treated by landowners at their cost as a regulatory requirement. So we're going to face some choices about whether we do this the hard way, which will be by regulation of land use, or whether there's going to be a mix of incentives that involve some funding assistance, etc. So I think we just got to see the size of the challenge for the region, and then all the choices available to the regional council about what's your mix of tools.
I'll just say any future paper needs to have that in it, because that's what's missing here.
There's not regulatory comment in there particularly. I noted that.
But no, that's the point that's missing here, that we have to deal with this one way or the other. I think it's a really important point, so we're making a choice here. All right. So I'll move that we receive a report. We ask the staff to prepare a business case, that the financials be referred to the Finance Audit and Risk Committee, and that we have a seminar on this, a one-day planning discussion on it, or discussion on it as part of the long-term planning process.
Second, or I'll second it, or?
Seconded, Craig, yep. Any discussion? All right, I'll put the resolution, all those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Contrary carried, contrary not carried. Can I just thank you too, Ballard? This is a huge task, and we have discussed this before, and again, to make the note, I think we're about 2 years behind where we should have been. Thank you all.
Gonna be busy.
Thank you. Ecological management and enhancement, plains, braided rivers, birds census.
Yeah, so I'd just like to introduce Martina and Keiko. So Martina is our acting manager of regional assets. So she's obviously in charge of all of our flood control schemes and other operations. And really this report, I think, is a good news story. All of our operations, we work under an environmental code of practice and an ecological enhancement plan written bespokely for each river. And this is part of the feedback on that performance. So I'll let Martina introduce the paper and go through the key points, and then Keiko's got a short presentation that we'll go through, and then happy to answer any questions.
So good afternoon. Just very quickly highlight few important points. So Heretical Plains are managing all rivers, and to do so, we do have to consider environment and ecology. And to help us with that, we have quite a few important documents like environmental code of practice, which have been implemented many years, probably in 1999 first version, and the latest upgrade was 2017 and implemented. And also very important document which anything we do on the rivers, we use the ecological management plans which started in 2010 for each of the Heretical Plains rivers. And we use our senior ecologist Keiko to help us, for example, with the survey, bird survey for activities like gravel extraction and beach raking. So I let Keiko to explain a little bit more on what it means, and I hope you're going to find it very interesting.
Thanks, Martina. So I'm here to report on the results of the bird survey, or we call it census because we count everything that we come across on the river. It is as part of the effectiveness monitoring of Ecological Management and Enhancement Plan, or EMEP for short. So just to expand on that, so EMEP has two parts. One is ecological management, another is enhancement. And this ecological management part is where a series of rules are provided for asset management group to follow when they're carrying out the flood control activities. And the main rules is around herbicide application to have no negative impacts or mitigate negative impacts of this operation on aquatic and terrestrial life. The weeds, so we have rules around machine maintenance and movement so that we mitigate or avoid or mitigate the spread of the weeds onto the gravel bed and also riparian zones. We also have a sort of an extra set of rules around value-specific management zones set aside for things like whitebait spawning sites and particular bird breeding spots. There are not many of them, but there are some. But the most stringent of all is the rules around protecting the river birds. And more precisely, for example, we don't carry out flood control activities during the peak breeding season. But if we have to do some operations on the either ends of the breeding season, then we will send a team of ecologists to survey the sections of rivers of interest to make sure that there's no breeding activities going on before we head out and do things. So as Martina said, we've been implementing this ecological management protocol since 2011, but what we hadn't done is monitoring of effectiveness to check if it's working or not. Then this monitoring will provide us information that we need for reviewing the ecological management protocols. So we set out to design the monitoring, and the obvious thing we need to measure is the birds. We're particularly interested in the birds that are heavily rely on a good braided river ecosystems. These 4 species are particularly the what we call river specialists. They are ground nesters. They require good open gravel beds. So they are good indicators of effectiveness of this ecological management protocols that we are carrying out, but they're also good indicators for the integrity of the braided river ecosystems because they're very sensitive to any changes. So we carried out the survey in November 2019, and we engaged a team of ecological experts. And we covered all of the 3 braided river systems, including the major tributaries of Tukituki River. That's 262 kilometers in total. And we, just to be clear, we counted all species heard and or seen during the survey, and some birds will be using the riparian zone, some birds are using the braided rivers, the gravel beds. And we recorded by smaller chunks. And I'll touch on that because it takes more time to record birds and count the total numbers per shorter sections, but it'll give us a spatially explicit data set. So that's how we designed the survey. Due to the time limit, I'm only going to report on the results on the banded dotterel, which is on the left there. So the results, so about this birds, this is endemic to New Zealand species, just as many other river specialists. It is unique to New Zealand. So the national population, or in this case global population, is 19,000. And just to put this into context, the North Island brown kiwi, we have 25,000 birds. So these birds are a lot scarcer. They are declining at an alarming rate nationally, 50% every 20 years, which is their 3 life cycles. Therefore, they are classified as threatened by the Department of Conservation, which is a worse status than the brown kiwi. But our survey results, we were quite pleasantly surprised by that. So we counted 2,308 birds across 3 rivers, and that's amount to 12% of the global or national population. So this officially puts Hawke's Bay rivers as a stronghold of the North Island rivers wall. And there is actually a ranking of 120 or so breaded rivers based on the banded dotterel numbers across the nation. And this puts our rivers quite high on the ranking, 2nd and 3rd Tuki-Tuki-Naroro, and 12th for the Te Kuri. So this is already on the radar of in the ornithological world. Again, this is quite a significant find coming out of the survey. The other really important results that we figured is the population trend. This graph shows the banded dotterel counts across 3 rivers since 1960s, and some years not all 3 rivers are surveyed, and also the survey sections vary amongst the years. So we need to look at this in a conservative way, but even with the conservative lenses on, there's no obvious population decline on Hawke's Bay rivers. And this is despite this rapid decline nationally. So again, this is quite a significant find, and I think it's worth noting that this pattern of no obvious decline has seen only by our rivers and also the rivers administered by Greater Wellington regions. So there's some circumstance there that perhaps our operation, when it's done right, has some good impact. As I said earlier, we surveyed so that we have a spatially explicit data set, and this is what I mean. So we were able to map the abundance of the birds per kilometre reaches and mapped it across the river systems. This is the first sort of spatially explicit data set that we have. So this is only a year 1 snapshot of the bird distribution, but we're starting to understand some sort of hotspot sections of the rivers based on the species. And we've done these kind of mapping for other species, such as the black-fronted dotterel in the middle and South Island pied oyster catchers on the far right. So what I'm trying to say is we are able to then overlay all these and find some, the hotspots in a very scientific way. So we can draw on some preliminary conclusions that our 3 rivers supporting quite a substantial amount of banded dotterels and the other species as we discovered. And based on those population trend, we have evidence that suggests that our flood control activities under the current ecological management regime has at worst neutral, at best the positive impact on river birds. And that is I think I can confidently say that this is the first ever tangible evidence to suggest that any flood control activities, if it's done right, have a neutral or positive impacts on the Breda River ecology. And it quite kind of defies the long-standing sort of perception that any flood control activities, such as beach raking, is bad for the birds. So we have some evidence to suggest against that. And finally, and most importantly, our ecological management and enhancement plan and all the protocols are effective. So the next step for us is to repeat the survey this coming summer. And it's important to repeat the survey because we would like to remove the year-to-year variations. And then we will be able to carry out some full review of the ecological management and enhancement plan based on those robust information. And I think there is a small room for improvement, so we continuously improve that. And I think our EMEP is already some of the most robust and stringent ecological management protocol that we have in the country. And I think with this continuous improvement, we can become a model region when it comes to flood control activities with the ecological outcomes. So that's it for my presentation.
Thank you, Keiko.
Yeah. All right, questions?
Yeah, Chair.
Well,
Great news story there. So it's good to hear. What do you think's happening in the South Island, or where the major decline's happening? What's impacting on that?
I think so I didn't mention the predation because that is the underlying and most significant impact on the birds. But this is about the effectiveness of our management. But the South Island, the predation is just as bad or worse than here. But the other aspect to add to the decline, a driver of decline, is the weed encroachment. So there's already a couple of studies done that weed cover goes up, the bird number goes down on those river specialists. And that's what's happening in a lot of the Breda rivers in Canterbury and other Breda rivers. So, yeah.
Any other questions? Charles?
So the birds are actually living their normal lifestyle, they're not adapting to what we're doing?
Adapting to what we are doing.
Yeah, like they haven't moved to higher ground? So they're not impacted by flood?
I guess they evolved to be in the river, so I think they adapted to the flooding, for example. So their breeding cycles, when they're peak breeding, if there is a flood that washes all the nest, then they'll come back and try to lay the eggs. So they evolved to be like that, but we don't know yet the impact of climate change driven, extreme flooding event, for example, how they're going to respond to it. All I'm saying is because it's declining elsewhere, the pie is becoming really small. So any of those extreme events going to hit harder than before.
Anyway, Councillor Ormsby.
Thank you both for coming. I think I smiled throughout the whole presentation, which is something I'm not sure I've done this whole day. But I just want to ask about if you could pinpoint one practice, a part of the management plan that you can relate to the successfulness of the trend, bird numbers. Could you pinpoint that?
I guess the main thing is that they cannot do beach raking or gravel extractions when the birds are breeding. And that's easier said than done because they have to get a clearance from the ecologist, and also big, summer months, they wanted to get out and do the beach raking, but a certain period of time they cannot. So that is the sort of effort that is reflected in this bird number, despite we still have a predation impact, but all this other effort seems to be working.
If I can just add to it, so since probably last 5 years, we significantly changed the way we do activities on the river. So we don't go just any time when the condition says it's good. We do consider, you know, the ecological value. So we have to get an ecologist to survey the river to make sure that there is nesting or not nesting, and mark those areas, and then we can do the activities. So it's significantly changed in last few
Priority.
years. It's very much priority for us here.
Can I just make another observation? I've walked many kilometres of the Naruru and Tuki rivers for recreational shooting, and there's several things that I've noticed. Firstly, how many possum traps there are amongst the trees as you walk through. So there's obviously been quite a lot of work done on that. I don't know how often you go and see the bait stations. The second thing is, I've been really pleasantly surprised how many fantails there are. They're always a sign to me that there's up the hill. There's a lot of them there. Pleasantly surprised by that. And thirdly, the dogs quite often find a cat, a feral cat, which we dispose of, but we haven't found any possums. And I'm really surprised at the number of hunters who don't deal to a cat when they get one. And I just think you should. I think they are your biggest reason for, as you said, the South Island predators. Feral cats chomp through a lot of birds. And on those, if you've got a lot of grass net around there, and the birds are breeding on the rocks, this gives cover for the cats to get them. And they are ferocious hunters. So we have to deal with the predator cats. And I think the council could encourage other recreational users of the river flats to go and deal to the cats, report them, make sure that they know that they're a number one pest to get rid of, because they eat a lot of birds. So I think the number of feral cats in the area is actually quite low, but the bird numbers will go up if you get the cats down to zero. That's the answer. That's the secret to it. You manage all you like around the raking, all the rest of it. But if it's there's a whole pile of hungry cats around, don't matter. They'll clean everything out. Right?
Thank you. I was going to make an observation about the water conservation order, that we're somewhat victims of our success here, and the dotterel factor is being relied on heavily in evidence by Forest and Bird as a reason why the lower Naruroro is an outstanding braided river habitat. And yet equally, you've just demonstrated that the order is not necessary, because you've done all of this work within the management plan and they're doing fine with risks like predation, simply unable to be managed by a water conservation order. So it's an
That's
interesting dilemma.
Hunters will do that. One cat's worth 10 pheasants. Right. Someone moved the report be received. Anyway, Singer. Is that what you will? All right. Thank you for the report. Really good news. We like good news stories. Thank you. I'll put the question. All those in favour would say aye.
Aye.
Country no. Carry. Braided Rivers. Right. Lincoln University survey. Who's dealing with it?
So this is just an information item, Chair. It doesn't require any significant discussion really. It was just for the council's benefit that we got some further analysis undertaken of the Hawke's Bay sample group from the national survey that's undertaken every 3 years by Lincoln University on perceptions on the environment. And as the paper notes, there are some differences in Hawke's Bay in relation to the national averages on some of the questions, particularly in relation to water management. And I think it's noteworthy that there is a view within the community, at least as represented by this sample, that the management of our lakes and rivers is deficient in the region, which is something we need to continue to be cognizant of. And I guess related to that, the communications team is currently working on a communications plan around the entirety of our water-related work to try and ensure that we have the maximum level of awareness within the community as to what the Regional Council is doing to manage the issues on freshwater.
Thank you. I read the survey till I got the answers on oil and gas exploration, and they were completely out of whack with what I thought the community was, so I ignored the rest of it.
I'll move a receipt of the report, Mr. Chairman.
I'm taking notice of this, and that's what the answers got up with.
I'll move a receipt of the report.
Thank you. Councillor Coote, have a seconder? Councillor Ormsby. Any discussion? I put the motion. Report be received. Those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Contrary no. Carried. The survey. Flood control scheme. Late item.
Yes, I just invite Martina and David Kedeker forward. So David's our acting regional projects manager. And this paper, I guess Councillor Barker reminded us that perhaps some councillors weren't fully aware of where this project was. And so we put it on the agenda as a late item, really as a reminder. It does substantially reflect the paper brought to you a couple of meetings ago. It is our intention to bring regular updates at key points and key gateways in the project life cycle, but this was really more of just a reminder paper, and certainly Martina and David are happy to go through any detail or questions.
Well, could I just do some preliminary on this? I asked for this to be put on because I've heard at this council meeting a couple of discussions where people have expressed concerns about where we're up to with our river protection rates and concerns about are we doing enough. I just put a peg in the ground a way back. In the beginning of the 20s, we had a flood outbreak in the Bay of Plenty which caused a lot of damage. Following that, there was an almost overflow in the Manawatu. And the government of the day saw that there was millions of dollars being spent on repairing these things and was our infrastructure up to scratch. So a central government review was ordered of all of these flood protection schemes, and it came back that they were all in reasonable shape, including Hawke's Bay. So that's 20 years ago. But that's not like 1 in 100 years. And we've now said we want to look at going to 1 in 500 years. And these are slow-moving things. So current settings, things are okay. But we need to be for the future. Now, what I think, if you just turn to the chart that you've got on there, which I think is a really interesting chart, we've got several things we need. Before we make decisions, we need to have engineering advice. We need to know about land ownership, the quality of the banks, how much capacity our river protection can carry now, what it would mean to go to 1 in 500. It might mean higher stop banks in some areas. It might mean shifting them out. There's all sorts of those issues. So there's a lot of work to be done, and we've got here to the design phase happening in July, sometime after July 2021. So this whole work program to get to start is just over a year away. And I would have thought, in terms of a project of this size, that is pretty imminent. So I just want to say that we've got a lot of work being undertaken now about land matters being investigated, engineering options, and we'll get reports on this as we go through. So I'm just putting that there to say to you, this is where we've got to. There was a call at one stage for us to have another seminar to go over this, but I'm wondering whether in fact that is actually necessary. If in the light of this report and other information you still think we need to go over this, well, I'm happy to entertain it, but I'm not quite sure. Given that it's pretty imminent, you with me? Work's being underdone, and you'll have several reports on this on the way through. I'm just thinking about time. So we're going to have a seminar. It's look like a planning day. It's talking about a day set aside. I'm just wondering, do we need it in addition to the reports we're going to get, given that this is moving at, I would have thought, pretty high speed. Now, is that a reasonable summary of it?
Look, absolutely. And look, one of the best points to feedback is when we finish the modelling, because that will provide guidance as to the current level of service, some of the issues and some of the options, and that's probably after September, that sort of time.
So about September we will have a pretty detailed paper about what the options are.
The outcomes of the modelling, and then there's still a lot of work, engineering, concept design to go from there, but that will, and we're modelling 3 scenarios, the 1 in 100, 1 in 200 and 1 in 500 with climate change, and that will present a picture of the strengths and opportunities within the current network, and will give a good overview of the current performance. And then the next step is we look at the various options to look at those opportunities.
All right, councillors, does that, so you're quite happy with that? So you're looking at September?
Around September. Yep.
September, and we'll be coming back with 1 in 100, 1 in 200, 1 in 500, concept ideas, and we'll then get some idea about the timeline to move from there. Will that information satisfy your need to know at this stage? Neil?
Mr. Chair, can I just clarify, at your paragraph 5, you've specified the river plains, Tutakuri, Ngāroro, Clive, Lower Tukituki. I'm making an assumption that it's also the associated networks around it. One example comes to mind, the Taipo stream. Would your scoping include in the Puramu, those other Napier urban waterways, are they part of the scope?
No, sorry, can I?
Yep, you can answer that, yep.
Sorry, so no, so the Napier urban or the urban waterways needs to be a joint project with the other council, Napier City Council and Hastings District Council, where the rivers are purely undertaking with regional council. If they are separate projects, they have separate deadlines and timeframes, so they are not a joint project.
So they're not in this scope?
No, so the reason is they are, although they're referred to as one in the same in name, they are quite different systems. We're very much looking at the flood control system, which delivers 1 in 100.
Sure.
Taipo and Napier Miani and those other drainage areas are drainage systems, and they have a nameplate about 1 in 5 level of protection. So we're focusing on the flood control at 1 in 100 level.
Supplementary to that,
Supplementary, Councillor Curtin.
what is the intended work plan for those? I mean, it comes to mind the Tamatea flood of 10 years ago, how devastating that was. What's the plan for scoping those urban waterways?
So all of our schemes will be reviewed going forward to understand the impact of climate change, and that's something we'll discuss in our workshop afterwards, and something we'll be talking about going into the LTP. And particularly in Napier, Napier's recently done a lot of work that we'll connect into. So we've shared our modelling with their modelling and got a network view, and so that's at a draft stage, and so there's further work to do with Napier to understand the performance of the combined Napier-Miani network.
So could I suggest that when you come back to us in September, that you have a reflection on these issues in the report, so we know that we've got these ones here being done because of HBRC alone, and then for Councillor Curtin and others to interested in what's happening with the Napier, jointly, what's happening there, so we have a description of that. Because I think what Councillor Curtin is trying to say, leave no river behind.
And certainly we have 25 schemes. All of those schemes need a review, and so that's a significant piece of work going forward.
And we are setting up a working group for the Napier-Miani waterway, for example, with Napier City Council, where we're going to be jointly together, working together, scoping it and doing the time frame. So we are already thinking how we're going to be delivering this piece of work.
Okay. Satisfied? You right, Roger?
Thanks for the update.
I'll move that the report be received. Have a seconder. Councillor Ormsby, all those in favour will say aye.
Aye.
No, carried. We now come on to the next item, is items for minor matters, not on the agenda, and Martin's got 2, regenerative farming and water security.
Yes,
Martin.
thank you. They are related. It starts from the motion that was carried in February, which had 2 components to it. One was squarely around water security and I guess a storage sense. One was looking at conservation practices. Now, there's been quite a lot of talk in the media in the last couple of weeks, which builds on a public conversation that's been surfacing for some time around regenerative farming practices. And former Councillor Tom Belford wrote a piece in the paper on Saturday talking about the need to ensure that we are doing the very best by way of farming practices on land before we start talking about any, in his view of it, residual need for storage. There is a piece that was also referred to us by former Councillor Belford, by Professor Gluckman, looking at that topic and advising of the need for further research around regenerative farming practices. It has been suggested in the public that this council isn't interested in that conversation and purely focused on building dams with its water security dimension. And I want to ensure that the public understands that that's just simply not the case. And there are a number of dimensions to this council's work stream that look at it in the issue of water security in a more holistic way, including the support for the Future Farming Trust and the program of work through the Tukituki Leaders Forum for the Central Hawke's Bay Water Security Project. There's also the regional water assessment that's PGF funded, which is looking at a natural capital-based approach to a region-wide water demand assessment. And the conversation about water security lives in that context. But I guess my point is, and I'd like the staff to think about, there is a degree of legitimacy to the argument that if you're going to look at water storage, as part of that analysis, you need to understand what we could do better with best practice and with the latest research. And there's all sorts of country calendar programs that you see about restorative, regenerative farming practices that might reduce demand for water. And I think only once you've done that and wrestled that topic to the ground do you fully understand what building and factoring in climate change we're going to need by way of water storage. Because I'm willing to bet that just as the argument water storage is not the complete solution, nor is regenerative farming practices. But at the moment we are faced with the possibility that we might walk through that process of looking at options for water storage, and at the end of that process have a number of members of our community come at us and say, well look, you don't need any of this, what about regenerative farming? So the question I've got, and I'd just like the staff to think about it, how do we support what, if any, additional work needs to be done either through Future Farming Trust or within the Regional Water Assessment Framework or the Tukituki Leaders Forum or wherever else, to ensure that at the time we emerge through our feasibility phase of options for different scale water storage, both here at Taonga and Central Hawke's Bay, we understand what can be achieved in quantitative terms from regenerative farming practices. And I don't know where that research is. I don't know if it exists anywhere yet, but the proposition that I've seen on the Greenpeace website is that you don't need water storage, you just store water in the soil. So how much? Let's quantify it, let's understand it, and not assume that it's a complete answer, but equally let's not ignore it because it is an important dimension to the debate. So that's my minor item, Mr. Chairman, a request for staff to advise us where that conversation best lives, how we bring that information to the surface so that we've got a quantified response to that proposition in front of us at the same time as, say, any sort of feasibility level options for water storage at different scales.
Thank you. Councillor Folwell.
You too?
Yeah, you were separate. Yeah.
You followed both of them in the same question, actually.
Yeah, look, and I'm not supposed to be responding to Martin, but my notice kind of is. So just, in response to what Councillor Williams just said and what's been discussed previously and out there in the media a lot, I guess the opportunity has arisen for those of us councillors or anyone in Hawke's Bay that wants to learn more about this. There's a couple of seminars coming up and they're being presented by the farmer Peter that was on the Country Calendar episode that attracted so much attention, and he's doing a nationwide tour. So he's in Hawke's Bay next Wednesday the 8th in Clive at 9 o'clock in the morning, and that's at the Clive Hall, and in Waipakarau on Wednesday afternoon 2 o'clock at the Civic Theatre. So I just thought it would be good to obviously notify those times and venues, so for those of us that are keen to learn more, then this is probably the perfect opportunity of where to start. And I can send those links to other councillors to share.
Please do. It'd be good. Send it to all councillors. It'd be great. Thank you. All right. That's the end of my items. Will someone move the resolution to move into public exclusion, please?
So move, Mr.
Councillor Foss, Councillor Curtin. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. Carried.